And nothing beats a trail to travel farther every day. I'd rather have lake and trees and rock than a hideaway in a southern box.
Hi, Dave Hadfield here with the third installment of Traditional Bush Gear. And today we're going to talk about the wood stove. And hot tenting in the winter is sweet. It's not the only way to go, but it is kind of the only way to go, if you know what I mean. It's both efficient and pleasant to have the space heated in the winter, and these little units are terrific little cook stoves as well, as long as there's a cutout so that you can lower your pot right into the flames. In fact, they're such good little cook stoves that I actually take them with me on canoe trips as well. Anyway, I was introduced to them in the middle 1980s. I've been using them ever since. I built about a dozen, and I'm spoiled rotten. I really like them. I've been putting together a video about how to build one, but this episode is more about how to run one. And to start, here's an excerpt from that construction video. The essential features of a little stove like this are lightweight. It only weighs, I think it's 11 pounds. That's it. And so that makes it really convenient if you want to carry it in a canoe or on a toboggan for a snowshoe trip. And it has, as you can see, a cutout on the top here for a pot that can be lowered right into the stove. So you can boil a liter of water in that really fast. It has a stovepipe, for the chimney here to take the smoke away. And it has a hinge door with a draft control. And all the stovepipe stores inside the stove as you travel from place to place, and there's enough room in there for about 12 feet or maybe a little more of stovepipe. It's a really efficient little heater. It really works well. And on a snowshoe trip, when in the evenings when it's 35 or 40 below outside, and you're inside this canvas enclosure, and you've got this fired up, and there's a little section of it right on the side here that's glowing red hot. And you're sitting right beside it, and you're tired because you've been pulling on a toboggan all day or breaking trail on snowshoes, and your buddy hands you a mug of something nice, and you just soak up the heat, and you go, and you wouldn't trade it. You really wouldn't trade it for a little gas burner or something. It's much, much better. However, it's not inherently safe, and that's really important, right? It is not CSA approved. Or any underwriter would probably have a heart attack if you put it in a house or a garage. And anytime it's going in any kind of situation, any enclosed environment, anytime it's fired up, someone should be watching it. At least keeping half an eye on it. If you left this glowing and then wandered off on a snowshoe hike and came back again, you might find your tent burnt. And if you burn down your house or your garage or something with one of these, it's not my fault. All right? It's not inherently safe. Someone has to be watching it. It must be used with common sense. And that's my disclaimer. And it's an honest one. However, if you use it intelligently and with common sense, it does its job really well. So this is not a zero-trace rig. It's not for your local conservation area or even the most commonly frequented parts of the provincial parks. If you're in a place where it doesn't feel right to be cutting firewood, then don't do it. Go somewhere else. This is a northern rig, and it's designed for the Canadian boreal forest or Alaska or remote places where cutting firewood and poles is absolutely no problem. But since that describes about half of Canada, there is lots of opportunity. So let's deal with some frequent questions or perhaps even misconceptions about these stoves. And the first is, do they have to be airtight and super efficient? And the answer is no. All they have to be is a box with a fire in it. We're not trying to heat your house in winter with a limited supply of firewood. I mean, more efficient is better than less efficient, but the difference between an airtight versus a stove like this one on a camping evening is one armful of firewood. And on a snowshoe trip, that just doesn't matter. In fact, you always end up leaving firewood behind. What matters most is lightweight, portability, and a good draft to keep the smoke away. So what kind of firewood do we burn in these stoves? And the answer is dry firewood. Spruce, pine, poplar, birch, it doesn't matter as long as it's dry. And what this translates to is generally you camp where there's firewood. What's perfect, and what you look for as you're walking along, is a grove of jack pine that's probably grown up after a forest fire, and they've grown up too thick, they've choked each other out, and some of them are standing, dry, and leaning against their neighbors. Those poles that have been drying for several years like that are perfect to saw up for firewood. We never plan on finding firewood like that in the commonly used places, and we certainly don't bring anything like fire logs along. So that means we seek out the more remote places, which is no bad thing. So, next question. If you cut a hole in the top of your stove, won't that smoke you right out of your tent? And you might think, well, I do have a disc of metal that fits over the hole here as a stove lid. You might think a lot of smoke will come out the hole, but in actual fact, when it's flowing, when it's hot, when it's burning, the movement of air is into all the nooks and crannies. It's being sucked in and going out the stovepipe, not the other way around. When you do set it up, though, to help the draft at least get started, you normally raise the back about ½ an inch or so. That helps. It's really important with these small stoves, if you're going to cook on them, and you might as well cook on them because they're good cook stoves, is to have this ring, this cutout in the top of the stove. And I have sized it to be just a little bit bigger than my middle-sized pot. And that way I can take an old-fashioned pot, and these are the best ones for the job, not the modern ones, the old-fashioned ones that are tall and skinny with a bale handle rather than the modern ones. Anyway, these things will just go right in there, and if you get a brisk fire going, or even a quick flare-up fire of twigs and things, and then you put this half full of water in there, the heat transfer is really efficient, and you can boil water with a decent fire faster in this stove than you can on your kitchen stove at home. It's amazing. Let me step in here and say I've never taken a gas stove on these trips. There's just no need to carry the extra weight if you're traveling where there's wood. Having an efficient wood-burning cook stove really simplifies things. Well, this is not a new pot. I bought this quite a while ago at a surplus store just to make sure I'd have enough to last for the rest of my life. And so it hasn't actually been used, and that's why it's clean. People tend to not want to do this because your pots get black. Well, so what? Who cares if your pots get black? You own the pot doesn't own you. And I have a nesting set of these pots, 3 of them, and they go together for transport. And I put them in a cloth bag, and it doesn't matter if they're sooty on the outside or not. I don't clean the soot off. It's not a problem in any way. Next question. Why doesn't this stove have legs? Well, stove legs are great if you're camping on the ground, but in winter we're often camping 3 feet above the ground on packed snow. Legs, which just perch on packed snow, don't work out very well because there's melt down below and the stove legs give way and your stove sinks. I have legs for this stove, and I never bring them on a winter trip. The easiest way to rig this stove is simply wire it to 2 green sticks and lay them in the snow. Pack it down first. That'll work fine for an overnight. Sure, there will be melt away, but you'll be gone in the morning, so it doesn't matter. And by the way, the simplest method to control melt away is with a square of Typar house wrap. It's reflective, very fire resistant, folds up small, weighs almost nothing. It's totally effective at stopping your sleeping area from caving in. Anyway, how do we mount the stove in winter? Well, in a wall tent, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 campers, you need a good, solid mount because sooner or later somebody's going to trip against it. Everybody is moving in and out of the warm space of the wall tent to socialize or eat or to dry their clothes, and sooner or later someone is going to stumble and jostle that stove. You don't want it to spill. You'll lose your tea, you'll lose your food, and you can burn down your tent. You need a good, solid mount. But you also want something simple that doesn't take very long to set up or take down. When we set up a wall tent, we like to use a barrier log, and this separates the working area in the front from the sleeping area in the back. It's a firm divider. It can be any old log, doesn't have to be good wood. We just make it about 4 feet wider than the tent, slide it under the sidewalls, and that way it won't move around. And having that barrier log makes it really easy to mount stove logs. And we do that with a couple of spikes or a couple of screws. And by the way, with those pliers and a saw, you can recover the nails, which we do. You might ask, why don't we just dig all the snow away and set up the stove on the ground? And the answer is, in the winter, it's very liberating to be able to camp on the snow. You don't have to care how rough the ground is, or even if it's particularly level, because you're 2 feet above it. That means you can camp just about anywhere. You don't want to give that freedom up just to accommodate your stove legs. But for a more permanent camp, a stove leg design like this is pretty sturdy. So if we set the stove down on a couple of wooden poles, won't they just burn? Well, it's best to use green poles. And usually when you're clearing a tent site, you do end up with some green wood. In an overnight, they won't burn through. But for anything longer, you should have one protecting layer between the stove and the logs. These little fittings, homemade, just set into place. I don't spike them or screw them in, but to space them up off the log, I insert about 8 rivets, and the rivet tails do that. And once you get everything adjusted, you wire it on. Around the log, up and over the stove, back down to the other side, and around a couple of turns there. And that's all you have to do. It works. Next question is, can you buy one of these stoves? And the answer generally no. The market is very small, and manufacturers tend to be scared of the liability. There are some on the market, and I encourage you to do some research, but I've never found one commercially made that has the dimensions and the features that I like. Hey, that's not a showstopper. We can make just about anything work, and any stove in a tent is better than no stove in a tent, unless you're on fire. Next question, if I make one of these stoves, can I change the size? Well, you can, but smoke is the thing. The proportions of this stove have been worked out experimentally over the years to get the maximum size that'll still draw properly with a 3-inch pipe. It's 9 inches by 9 inches by 22. The stovepipe exits out the top, not the back. It'll draw fine with 3-inch pipe, and all that 3-inch pipe will fit into the stove itself for transport. Go ahead and experiment if you like, but I don't really recommend you mess with all that. Another question, wouldn't a collapsible stove be better? Wouldn't that pack down flat for transport? And maybe even collapsible stovepipe, too? Well, stovepipe is dirty, sooty, and so is the inside of a stove. I really don't want to be messing with that at 25 below with frozen fingers. That's a nasty job. This whole thing goes together neatly and simply for transport and only weighs 11 pounds with the stovepipe. That's hard to beat. On a winter trip, you need the heat that this thing puts out, so you don't want to make it more complicated to provide that heat. Okay, so why do I have the stovepipe going out the front door instead of out the top vertically? Well, there are 3 reasons. The first is that there's a ridge pole out there to tie it to, and you don't have to erect any other framework to support the stovepipe. You just take a piece of wire, go around the ridge pole, give it a couple of twists, then go around the stovepipe, give it a couple of twists, and you're done. It's pretty simple. And by the way, we don't screw the stovepipe sections together, not for a camp. We just keep an eye on them, and about every 3 days you have to take it apart anyway and clean out the soot by using a big pine branch and running it through like a pipe cleaner. The other reason is sparks. When it's calm, if the sparks go straight up, they're likely to come straight down and put holes through your fly sheet and or your tent. Having your stovepipe project forwards deals with that problem easily. Some people try and put a spark arrestor over the end of the pipe, but it doesn't work. They just clog up with soot and crap, and then they stop the draft of your stove and smoke you out. However, we bring a spare elbow on these trips just in case the one at the stove comes apart. And we can take that spare elbow and put it up at the end of the stovepipe if the wind is blowing into the end. The third reason for bringing the stovepipe out the front door is that way you don't have to put holes in the roof of your tent and your fly sheet. Life is a lot simpler without holes in the roof. So what kind of thimble is that, where the pipe comes out through the door? Well, that one's an antique. It's made out of asbestos. Try and buy that these days. But you can buy a stove thimble out of modern materials now. You just want it fairly stiff so that no flap of the tent fabric ends up against the hot pipe, which happened here and which I had to fix. You'll notice I have no damper in this stovepipe. Well, I did experiment with them, but I found with this 9x9 by 22-inch stove with 3-inch pipe, there was enough back pressure as it was, and a damper didn't help in any way, shape, or form. But whatever rig you come up with, go ahead, try one out. Another question is, do you put something on the stove bottom before you light the fire to stop the metal from buckling and warping? Well, it's a good idea, but it's not really necessary. On a winter trip, there's usually no sand or dirt available. But one thing you can do is put a layer of split logs in the bottom of the stove and then light your fire on that. It'll take a while for that to burn through, and by then the ash will help keep the bottom cool. When you're hand-hauling a hot tent rig on a toboggan, you really try not to bring extra stuff. You probably notice we're committing a terrible sin here by conventional thinking and cooking and eating food in our tent. How shocking! Well, if you go far enough north, the bears are asleep. In fact, in 40 years of winter tripping, I've never seen a bear track in the snow, and we're always looking. Same with coons, but what you get is mice in high population years, and sometimes every 3 or 4 days you want to move simply because of them. Anyway, I hope this video and my website have been of some use. And if you see my wall tent in the bush up north with smoke coming out the chimney, please drop by and take a cup of tea off the wood stove.
I dream of a wild forest. It seems to call my name. So green it goes forever, never settled, never tame. And there runs wild a river, so calm along the shore, that whispers, please come hither, come wander me once more.